Hello, my name is Sam, and this is the Early Modern Warfare podcast. This series is going to take a look at topics and wars related to the early modern period of European and Eurasian history from about the late 15th century to around 1720. Today's episode, I'm going to introduce the Italian Wars, which were conflicts between the House of Habsburg and Valois over control of Europe. And these wars are not really well represented in popular history or literature, but they had very long-ranging impacts on Europe and the wider world. So just to give some background into the state of Europe at this time, what was going on. In the 1490s and 1500s, it was really the time when Europe made its turn, or starting to turn, into the world power, colonizing power that it remained into, well, about the 20th century. In Spain, of course, had completed the Reconquista in 1492, removing the last remnants of Islamic rule from Iberia. In France, you had a growing and powerful monarchy under the Angevine, and then, for our purposes here, the Valois dynasty. You also had the emerging Habsburgs, who had been traditionally a weaker power among the states of the Holy Roman Empire, but starting in the Renaissance and definitely by the 16th century became a world power. Now, another important factor in this chaos was the destabilization of the Roman Catholic Church that had occurred in the late Middle Ages in a period known as the Great Western Schism. Now, what had happened with that, which I won't go into every detail today, essentially you had many decades of competing popes. You had legitimate popes, anti-popes, and all of this was implicated in European politics. And this really harmed the credibility of the Roman Catholic Church among a lot of European nobles. Now, during the Renaissance, the papacy returned to Rome, but as we know, sort of from popular memory, these Renaissance popes were often morally questionable. The papacy was very corrupt in some respects. But also, we have to remember, there's two sides to every story, and while many of these popes, such as one that'll be important today, Alexander VI, were morally questionable people, there was also a lot of impetus from European noble estates to get out from under the church for various reasons. Church lands were very valuable, and by church lands, I mean the lands that were sort of under the control of not just the parishes, but also religious orders. And, these things were very economically important too. For example, monks would often produce things, and, you had communities built around monasteries. And, this is a period too where religion and politics are one and the same. There's really no notion, as we would have today, of separation between church and state. So that brings our attention to France, and why did they invade Italy? So in the 1480s, the Angevine dynasty went extinct, and this gave the up-and-coming Valois dynasty a claim to the Kingdom of Naples, as well as the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which was by this time defunct. It was under Mamluk, and the territory would eventually come under Ottoman control. But France was a very strong military power. Their heavy cavalry wing, the gendarmes, were probably the best in Europe at this time. And they also had the support of Swiss pikemen as infantry. And the Swiss pikemen in this era of European military history were among the best infantry you could buy. And I use that phrase specifically because in this period there were not really standing armies as we think of today. It was mostly mercenary. You did have royal troops, and there were some exceptions to this, like with the Ottomans and some other examples, which hopefully we can talk about in a future episode. But by and large, most of your infantry forces and quite a bit of the cavalry are going to be hired mercenaries. And the Swiss were the best. And the Swiss were the best really because they helped contribute to the breakdown of the feudal medieval dominance of cavalry. Because just to go back to the medieval period, the warfare at the time was kind of limited. The numbers were very low. You have some large battles like Agincourt, but there's really not that many. It's mostly combat between mounted men, knights. Typically, you have kind of low casualties, and cavalry is dominant. They're really the most important. I mean, you have infantry in the medieval period, of course, but they're really not the tactical arm of decision. So what the Swiss do in their wars to resist the Habsburgs, they have this pike square called a hedgehog formation, and they're able to dismount the Habsburg knights and really do a lot of damage. And as we'll see, though, there's some limitations to that. It's very powerful against infantry or against cavalry, but can't really deploy on rough ground or uneven ground. Somewhat similar to the Macedonian or the Greco-Greek phalanx, if you're familiar with ancient history. Same idea. And going forward, a lot of the military thinkers of this period were intentionally harking back to that period. So the point here is the French had a pretty strong army, but there were other up-and-coming at this time European armies. The Spanish had really perfected a lot of tactics, and they had done a lot of innovating during their war against the Muslims in Grenada during the Reconquista. And you also have the German Landsknechts, who become a very dominant mercenary type of soldier on the battlefield. So the Italian Wars, the origins really begin in 1483, and that's when Louis XI of France dies, and it's his son Charles VIII that comes to the throne. And Louis XI left him a pretty good kingdom. It had a growing population. It was pretty strong in terms of royal authority, and the economy was also thriving at the time. France, unlike a lot of these other European states of the period, was in a better position to integrate more closely, just because France and Spain as well, it kind of makes sense if you look at it on a map of, as a geographic unit, whereas, as we'll see probably in future episodes with the Habsburgs, you have a bunch of disparate lands. They're not really geographically contiguous in a lot of cases, and it's sort of a difficult thing to pull together, that's a challenge the Habsburgs have. The French, not so much, but you have to remember at this time, it's not like just because Louis is the king, he can just do whatever he wants. That went, and this is true of all monarchs of this period. I think we kind of have a sense today that if they're the king, they can do what they want. That's not really the case. He's all monarchs at the time. They're going to have to deal with the clergy that have their own interests. They're going to have to deal with the the nobility, all their estates that constantly need have interests and needs, and the peasants too. I mean, it's not just like, well, they can ignore the peasants because for whatever, there's no constitution or whatever. The peasants have rights and duties under feudalism. That was pretty firmly established. And, so it's not all just this backward, place where no one did anything and everyone lived in dirt, and everyone had to answer to the king. It wasn't like that. But that aside, so Charles VIII, when he comes to the throne, and as an illustrative point to what I was just saying, the region of Brittany, it's connected to France, not really quite part of the kingdom. They want autonomy, and he has to put this rebellion down, and he does this, and he's only 13 years old when he comes to the throne, so he gets help from his sister, his older sister Anne, her husband, and then he also has help from his cousin Louis de Orleans, and Louis will be important later during the Italian expedition. So by 1491, after the several-year conflict, he's able to subdue Brittany, and he consolidates it into the lands that he controls. So this is really important because that gives him more resources, and it's also a demonstration of force and his authority. But there's repercussions to this internationally. So Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella, and England under Henry VIII have to, and as well as the Habsburgs, they had all supported Breton autonomy, but this kind of provoked some hostility from them. And as I mentioned before, so the House of Angevine goes extinct, and that had also given Charles and his father some additional lands that were directly under his control. So the areas of Anjou, Provence, and some other regions, and that gave him more access to the southern French coast and access to the Mediterranean directly. And so, like I said before, he has a claim on the Kingdom of Naples, and this is something that he really wanted. A lot of Charles's tutors and advisors were Italian humanists, so he really liked Italy and Italian culture, and he wanted to, he wanted this claim as sort of a point of honor, and he really liked the idea of being King of Naples. So he had this idea, but he didn't really fully understand, or maybe not understand, but he didn't fully have a fleshed out policy of how to deal with Naples. And from the surface, France's interests in Italy, at least in that part of Italy, were kind of unclear. Genoa was a lot closer. It had come under French occupation before. So that was the more logical area for them to expand into Italy if they wanted that kind of air region. But Charles really wanted to make France a Mediterranean power, and Naples would give him that ability. So he departed from his father's policy because, his father really viewed himself as kind of a mediating figure among these Italian states, because Italy at this time was not a unified nation state or kingdom. You have a bunch of different kingdoms. So you have Venice, which arguably is probably the most militarily powerful, and then you have the Republic of Florence, where the Medicis had a lot of power, as well as the Papal States, ruled over by the Pope. That was his kingdom, basically. And then you have some smaller ones like Lucca, Genoa, and Ferrara. And so they all kind of fought against each other, but there was a mutual understanding that they needed to sort of resist non-Italian aggression or interference into the peninsula. And they had mostly avoided that during the 15th century. Um, but this had kind of lulled them into a false sense of security, and it didn't help that Naples became this sort of point of contention because it had a non-Italian royal family. It was an Aragonian family that was on the throne of Naples, so it's sort of invited this kind of issue by having a foreign monarch in Naples. But the king that was on the throne of Naples, Ferrante, he had successfully resisted this pro-Angevine movement when he came to the throne in 1458. But he wasn't really that popular of a ruler with the nobility or subjects who actually liked the Angevines, and he didn't really make a lot of friends with the papacy because they didn't like him interfering in their affairs. In the papal affairs, excuse me, and the Venetians also wanted to check Neapolitan power because they wanted to keep Cyprus, which was the island that was in their control, and so there was the problem with Naples, and you also have the Duchy of Milan, which has their own interests, and they're motivated to actually bring the French in because they want to increase their power in the peninsula. But ultimately, the cause of the war is the French invasion and their aggression. And so Charles's goal with taking Naples was, like a lot of rulers in the 15th century, there was still a sense of wanting a crusade against the Ottoman Empire, and that was part of his motivation. He wanted to set up Naples as a base from which he could then launch a crusade against the Ottoman Empire. So to prepare for this, he settles a bunch of treaties in the early 1490s with the English in November 1492 and Aragon in January of 1493. And this was to address some lingering issues related to the war in Brittany. And then sort of his last bit of housekeeping was he had to make a truce in May of 1493 with Maximilian I von Habsburg, and that was also related to some other diplomatic problems that we won't get into here. So in January of 1494, really the inciting incident for the invasion is King Ferrante dies suddenly, but luckily for them, his heir Alfonso moves pretty quickly and consolidates his position as a new ruler. And so France sends some diplomats to the Pope, Alexander VI, that Borgia Pope, and they were ineffective. And Alexander VI was just completely confused by the fact that Charles would want to invade a Christian kingdom when the Ottoman Empire is sort of threatening a large invasion. And there certainly had been a lot of fighting in the late 15th century over Hungary, which is another topic I'd like to discuss in a future episode. But nevertheless, so Charles prepares his army anyway, and he has about 1,900 lancers, 1,200 mounted archers, and 19,000 infantry, and he anticipated getting an additional 1,500 Italian lancers and a few thousand infantry. And he just had one problem, though. He did not have enough ships to transport his army by sea, so he would have to go by land. Now in Naples, Alfonso was also preparing for war, so he renewed a bunch of contracts with some condottieri mercenary captains, and he also actually received an offer of support from Sultan Bayezid II for 20,000 men. When Bayezid learned that Charles was planning a crusade. But ultimately, Alfonso decides on a defensive strategy. He intended to keep Charles out of Naples altogether, so he planned on creating a revolt in Genoa, and then moving his forces into Milan, where he could sort of fight ahead and keep the French out of Naples altogether. And as far as the rest of the Italian states, so the reactions were pretty mixed, as you could imagine. So Florentines wanted to keep the commercial ties with France, but Piero de' Medici wanted to ally with Naples, and Medici's position is what became the Florentine policy. But the French also made sure to maintain their good relationships with the commercial class in the Republic, and as well as the civilians. And Venice proclaimed official neutrality, even though France promised them some land in that hypothetical crusade. But they wanted to stay on the defensive against the Ottomans. And they also suspected a conspiracy between both Charles and Maximilian against them, which is not the case, but they certainly believed that to be the case. So when the war finally gets underway, Alfonso's plan to have an uprising in Genoa fails. There's already French and Milanese troops in the city, and the first engagement of the war is fought at Porto Venere, which is down the coast from Genoa proper, and the Neapolitans were unsuccessful at capturing this port, and they had to withdraw, before the French or the Genoese forces could arrive. And by late August of 1494, Charles VIII crossed the Alps into Italy. Sort of a Hannibal-like figure, I guess. So the next major engagement was at Rapallo, September 3rd. So you have Neapolitan troops under the command of Obietto Fieschi and another commander named Fregosino Campo Fregoso. They arrive at Rapallo, but due to weather conditions, their fleet withdrew, and that left their 4,000-man army unsupported. But Louis de Orleans arrived with 3,000 Swiss mercenaries, as well as Milanese and Genoese contingents. And what happens is the Swiss provoke the Neapolitans into a skirmish, and that snowballs into a battle. But there's uneven terrain, so the Swiss can't really deploy their pike square, and it's the Italian units that end up fighting each other, and the French side ultimately wins, partially because they have naval artillery, and the Neapolitans end up getting routed. Both of the commanders were taken captive. Swiss mercenaries are really brutal. They cut down the wounded and they plunder Rapallo. And so strategically, this really prevents Alfonso from stopping the French invasion from the north. And tactically, a lot of it is, even though people at the time may not recognize this, it's really a lot of signs of things to come. So you have combined arms. The French side, they have that, they're able to coordinate the naval gunfire with their infantry movements. You have different types of troops. That's also very important. You know, the Swiss mercenaries can't fight, so you have the Italian infantry with, who I believe were swordsmen, fighting. And as well, the sort of total nature of war that happens in this period in some ways. You know, you have a lot of devastation. Civilians are hurt. And going forward, unfortunately, this will be very common in this period. of a lot of looting and plundering of losing areas. So the French, they win, but they're inside their sort of alliance with the Milanese. There's some problems. So Milan's led by the Duke Ludovico Sforza, and they were growing weary of this large French army and the intentions of the French, primarily because Louis d'Orléans wanted to press a claim on the duchy, and the Milanese also had to bear all of the costs of French logistics. So, as you can see, that's kind of a deal breaker for the Italians. They're not really gaining much out of this alliance, and going forward, the Milanese will actually change sides. So on October 18th, Charles joins his main force at Piacenza, and he decides, after some internal debate, to march along the western coast of Italy, and he unsuccessfully tries to broker military access with Florence, and the French had to end up capturing the fortress at Fivizzano by surprise, and the sack caused a massacre of the defenders and many civilians. And as a result, the other Florentine fortresses surrendered pretty quickly, or they meet a similar fate. The next hurdle for the French was the stronghold of Sarzana, and this was a modern fort for the time, so it was equipped with these very high angular walls designed to resist artillery, and it was anticipated it could have held up the expedition for several weeks. However, Piero de' Medici, he negotiated a surrender with Charles for Sarzana, Pietrasanta, Pisa, and Livorno, just to avoid further devastation. And in the small state of Lucca, Charles takes out a loan, and this is another sign of things to come. Monarchs of this period, they have to take out a lot of loans to finance their army, and he also gets passage for his army through the small city-state of Siena. So the Florentines believed the loss of their fortresses was temporary, and so they give Charles a 120,000 florin subsidy. And this is another sort of aspect of warfare in this period that's very important. It's the constant need for money. They have to come up with new ways of getting money, new financial instruments, new ways of taxation, and it'll just evolve as this period goes on. But people at the time, they weren't fully aware of that. But by December, most of the Neapolitan army was stationed near Rome, but the French had done yet another sort of secret capture. They captured Ostia, the port, which cut off Rome from supplies, and the Pope sends some embassies to Charles to try and negotiate, but this doesn't really work, and Charles sort of threatens to call a church council and depose Alexander VI. And finally, the French king enters Rome on December 29th, and the Neapolitans had already withdrawn, but he ends up not deposing the Pope. They just reach an agreement for supplies and passage on the way to Naples. And they eventually leave Rome on the 28th of January, and they head south. And on the way, there's even more devastation of the villages that they perceived to be hostile. And even though the Neapolitan army was still intact and able to fight, King Alfonso abdicates and he evacuated to Sicily with the treasure he could gather. Ultimately, the French reached Naples in late February, and the king makes kind of an inauspicious entrance. There's not a lot of popular resistance, and he acquires a city pretty rapidly. There's not many problems immediately, but over the winter that they stay, during the winter, as Charles had been sort of in Rome and working his way south, the European powers began forming a coalition against France. So it's the Habsburgs, the Venetians, Spain, and Milan are all in talks to put aside any historical rivalries like with Venice and the Habsburgs, and form a Holy League or a League of Venice. And it wasn't explicitly anti-French. They claimed it was just collective security against unprovoked aggression amongst all of them. And Milan is part of this. So they ratify this in the spring of 1495. And that's when the war effort against France really gets underway. But in Naples itself, Charles doesn't make many radical changes, administrative changes, and he, ironically, can't be crowned King of Naples because he doesn't have papal sanction. So he's in control of it, but he's not the King of Naples officially. So he left the city on May 20th. He hoped he could get the papal investiture, but Alexander VI didn't want to grant it. And the coalition mobilized its forces in Lombardy and Veneto to check the French. And Ludovico Sforza, who's that Duke of Milan, he sends his army to Asti, demanding the surrender of the French garrison. And this position was important because it guarded Charles's march north when he had to get back to France. So Louis d'Orléans commanded the garrison there, the French garrison at Asti. He refused that and marched out to Novara. This was a really bad move for the French because it left that important position undefended. And by the end of June, the League army was assembled near Parma, and Louis was trapped under siege in Novara. So this really set the stage for the Battle of Fornovo. And Charles was marching north. He had about 11,000 men, and the League actually outnumbered him with 20,000. Francesco Gonzaga led the coalition, and he was advised to avoid battle, but he ended up wanting to deny Charles passage north. And they marched along the Taro River on July 6th, and they kept the League army on the opposite bank so they would be protected. And the Milanese plan was to attack the French advance guard of heavy cavalry and then assault the right side of the French center. And then they had Venetian stratiots, which were light cavalry, that were going to maneuver around and attack the left flank. But what ended up happening was the terrain and this desire that was common among Italian commanders of the time to maintain a lot of reserves meant that only about a fraction of the men that they had were actually committed to the attack. So Galizio de Sanservino was the commander for the first wave, and he did cross the river and attack the front of the French column, but the river was swollen, and the slow crossing gave Charles time to deploy his forces into fighting order. The stratiots became distracted, and they ended up plundering the French baggage train, but all that did was draw them away from the flank they were supposed to be hitting, And after an hour, the Italians just retreated back across the river, and the French were able to keep marching. So, in the sort of the dust after this, both sides claimed victory. Neither ended the battle unscathed, though. Kind of a draw in many ways. The Italians failed to use the superior numbers, and they suffered really heavy casualties. And they also left the French free to keep marching north. So, in a sense, kind of a strategic loss for the Italians. But after Fornovo, Charles VIII returned to Asti in 10 days later, July 15th, and he ended up being held up for the summer. He was waiting for fresh troops and more money. They always need more money. Gonzaga's army joined instead the siege of Novara. Louis hoped for relief, but Charles was not able to get more Swiss mercenaries until September. The League avoided massing at Novara. They wanted to avoid another big battle, and Louis ended up leaving Novara in late September in defeat. His garrison was really depleted, and he was not able to acquire Milan, even though he wanted to. So despite not taking the throne of Naples, Charles was pretty satisfied with his victories, and he thought that his operation had been a success, all things considered. So the League decided again to attack Charles with a new effort, and this time Venice and Spain spearheaded it. So they brought in a commander named Gonzalo Fernandez de Cordoba, who had a reputation as the great captain, and he arrived in Calabria in May of 1495. He was going to help Ferradino, who was the son of Alfonso, take Naples back from Charles. So in July of 1495, the Spanish and Neapolitan army was beaten by the French heavy cavalry and their Swiss infantry at Seminara. So Cordoba, though, learns from this, and he took several months to build up a heavy cavalry force that could check the French gendarme, and also replacing the swords for his infantry with pikes. Ferradino reached Naples on July 6th during the night, and some of his subjects actually revolted against the French government, but the occupying forces were able to retreat into the fortifications, and they kept the city, which kept the city in their hands. So after several months of siege and a gunpowder mine, which was kind of novel for the time, on November of 1495, the Aragonese army captured the Castelnuovo fortification, but the city didn't fall to them until February of next year, when Castel del Ovo, just another one of the fortifications, finally fell. So again, this is another sign of things to come. You have these major fortifications, and these battles aren't really as important. Now I should qualify that and just explain in a lot of the academic literature about this period. There's a debate over, well, were battles important, or battles weren't important. It really depends on the theater of war, obviously. But definitely in many cases, like with Italy, and in this case, and later we'll see in Hungary, the fortresses are very important. Pitched battles just really don't change the strategic situation a whole lot. So eventually Ferradino's able to retake the city, but his kingdom is still controlled by the French, basically, or their supporters. And he died in October of 1496, and his father had also passed away the previous winter. So, the succession goes to his Alfonso's younger brother, Federico. And the last French garrison holds out until February 1498. So it takes quite some time to finally mop up the last French holdouts. To the Italians of the time, after this is concluded, the French affair, it seemed to be over, but not many people predicted that the wars would continue for several decades. This goes on until the mid-16th century, so it still goes on for quite some time. And the first French expedition is kind of interesting because we see there's a sign of all these future military innovations. You have combined arms, the importance of fortifications, the importance of siege. But there's still that medieval legacy that's still very strong and still very effective. That French heavy cavalry, they were pretty much the best in Europe. And they were a tactical arm of decision. You have the pikemen, but there's the limitations of them kind of come out as, the Swiss pikemen, as we discussed, there's some periods, or there's some incidents where they can't deploy in fighting formation. So it's a mix of both medieval and what will become early modern warfare. And artillery also, we see that becoming important, both like with the naval guns at Rapallo. So there's all these changes that are slowly occurring, and like I keep saying, it's not always apparent. People aren't fully aware of this at the time, but things are changing, and there's sort of a new era of warfare that's dawning. Another thing that's, again, a sign of what will happen as the decades wear on, the devastation of the countryside and the looting, that is something that happened all over Europe, the 16th and 17th century. And that was a big change from the limited warfare of the Renaissance era. So there's a lot of new changes going on in this period of time. And just to wrap up here, Charles died in April of 1498, and that leads to the accession of his cousin Louis as Louis XI. So the new king, he felt like he had unfinished business in France, and he definitely wants to go in again. So that's what we'll explore in the next episode. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed.